Louisiana Crime Files is brought to you by NeutralGroundz.com, a dedicated platform for streaming exclusive documentaries and shows that capture the soul of Louisiana. This month, we're giving away a custom red camo Newtral Groundz iPad. For details on how to enter, tap the link in the description. New Orleans is known for its vibrant streets, its rich culture, and the unmistakable sound of jazz echoing through every corner. But in 1918, that lively beat was overtaken by something much darker. Fear crept into the homes of the city's residents, and it wasn't just the ongoing war or the struggles of the times. This fear had a name, though no one knew who he really was. They called him the Axeman. It began quietly. Families, most of them grocers, went to sleep never expecting that they would be next. The killer didn't steal, didn't leave a trace of his intentions, except for the horror he left behind. And he always carried one unmistakable weapon, an axe. As the bodies piled up, so did the questions. Who was the Axeman? And why did he spare citizens who listened to jazz? Let's find out in one of the scariest true stories in New Orleans history. The Axeman's first known victims were Joseph and Catherine Maggio, a couple who owned a small grocery store in New Orleans. On May 23, 1918, they were found unresponsive in their home by Joseph's brothers. Both had been attacked during the night. The Axeman then struck both victims with an axe, perhaps in order to conceal the cause of death. Joseph survived the attack, but died minutes after being discovered by his brothers, and authorities quickly realized this was no ordinary crime. The method was unusual. There was no sign of a struggle, and most strikingly, no items were taken. The couple's home was undisturbed, aside from the tragic scene left behind. Investigators initially focused on Joseph's brother Andrew as a potential suspect. The razor found near the scene was linked back to him. It was a tool from his barber shop that he had recently brought home. Andrew, however, was deeply shocked by the incident, and after thorough questioning, the authorities couldn't find any solid evidence to hold him responsible. The motive for the attack was unclear. The Maggio family was well respected in the community, and like the other grocers in the neighborhood, they lived a quiet, modest life. With no money or belongings missing, the police were left with a chilling mystery. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. The case shook New Orleans, leaving residents fearful and on edge. The quiet routine of daily life was interrupted by uncertainty and fear, as it seemed no one could explain why these two individuals had been chosen. The authorities were unable to track down leads, and the lack of witnesses left the case in a frustrating standstill. As news spread about the incident, the public began to realize this could be the beginning of something much larger. The city, already tense from the effects of war and economic strain, now had a new shadow looming over it. The sense of unease grew as people wondered if this would happen again, and who might be next. This tragic event marked the beginning of what would later be known as the Axeman's Reign of Terror, a series of unexplained attacks that would confound the city's best investigators and leave New Orleans forever marked by the fear of an unseen figure lurking in the night. In the weeks following the Maggio case, New Orleans residents were still grappling with the shock and confusion surrounding the attack. The police too were working tirelessly but struggling to piece together any clues. Then just 1 month later, a similar crime took place that sent even more fear through the city. On June 27, 1918, Louis Bassumer and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, were attacked in their home behind the grocery store they operated. Both were found severely injured but still alive, making this a rare case where the victim survived. As with the Maggio case, there were no signs of robbery, and nothing valuable was taken from the home. The weapon used in the attack? An axe found near the scene, much like before. Harriet Lowe was able to give some initial statements to police while recovering in the hospital. She identified Louis Bassoumi as a possible suspect, claiming that he may have been involved in the attack. This accusation, however, was complicated. Harriet's condition worsened, and she passed away a few weeks later due to complications from surgery, leaving behind more questions than answers. Louis Bassoumi, meanwhile, denied any involvement in the attack and was eventually released due to a lack of evidence. This case left investigators no closer to solving the mystery. The similarities between the Maggio case and the attack on Bassoumi and Lowe were undeniable. Both families were grocers, both homes were broken into during the night, and the use of an axe tied the two incidents together. The public was growing restless, and the police were under increasing pressure to find answers. As more details emerged, the media began speculating about the possibility of a serial attacker targeting the city's Italian grocers. But without concrete evidence or a clear pattern, the authorities were left chasing shadows. With each passing day, the tension in New Orleans grew. People began locking their doors, something not often done in those days, and families in the Italian community in particular lived in fear of being next. The attack on Bassoumi and Lowe marked a turning point. No longer was this seen as an isolated event. It was clear now that New Orleans was dealing with a much larger, more terrifying problem. The Axeman wasn't just a figure of fear anymore. He was a real, present danger, and no one knew when or where he would strike next. As the summer of 1918 continued, the tension in New Orleans only grew. After the attacks on the Maggio family and Louis Bassoumi, the city began to sense that these were no isolated events. But it wasn't until August that the true terror of his spree became impossible to ignore. On August 5, 1918, Anna Schneider, a young woman who was 8 months pregnant, was found in her home severely injured after being attacked in her sleep. Her husband returned home from work to find her bleeding, but miraculously she survived the brutal assault. She couldn't remember much, only that she had been struck while resting. Her attacker had used a blunt object, something from inside the home itself. The baby she was carrying was unharmed, but the attack left the city rattled. Once again, no valuables were taken and the motivation remained unclear. Only 5 days had passed until the Axeman struck again. Joseph Romano, an elderly man living with his nieces, became the next victim. Like the others, Joseph was attacked in his home, but this time his nieces were nearby. They rushed to his aid after hearing the commotion, arriving just in time to see a shadowy figure fleeing the scene. Joseph, though gravely injured, managed to hold on for a few moments before succumbing to his wounds. The nieces described the attacker as a tall man wearing a dark suit and a hat, but their description was vague, leaving little for police to work with. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Each attack seemed to target grocers or their families, and while some survived, many did not. There was no robbery, no personal vendetta that could be determined. The weapon of choice, a blunt object or axe, remained consistent, and the randomness of the violence was terrifying. New Orleans, already a city on edge, was plunged into panic. Italian grocers in particular began living in fear, locking their doors and keeping a watchful eye on the streets. The police were no closer to solving the case, and the public grew desperate for answers. But as the attacks continued, so did the mystery. The Axeman moved through the city undetected, leaving chaos in his wake, and no one knew who would be next. It wasn't just the crimes themselves that haunted the people. It was the silence that followed. Each case brought the same result: no arrests, no evidence, and no explanations. The Axeman, it seemed, was unstoppable. As fear and uncertainty gripped New Orleans, it became clear that the attacks weren't just random acts of violence. There was a purpose to them, a method to the madness. But nothing could have prepared the city for what would come next. On March 13, 1919, the Times-Picayune received a letter, and its contents would terrify the people of New Orleans even more than the attacks themselves. The letter was from someone claiming to be the Axeman, In it, he taunted the authorities, saying they would never catch him. But the most chilling part of the letter was the promise of another attack. He warned that on a specific night he would strike again, but with one strange condition. According to the letter, any home where jazz music was played that night would be spared from his next attack. This bizarre demand left the city in a state of disbelief. Was this really from the Axeman, or was it a cruel hoax designed to play on the city's fears? As the night of March 19th approached, the people of New Orleans took the letter seriously. Jazz music filled the streets. Clubs, homes, and even small shops played music late into the night. The city for one evening became a festival of sound, all in an attempt to avoid becoming the Axeman's next target. And it worked. No attacks were reported that night. The music had, in some strange way, saved the city from further terror, at least for the moment. But the Axeman's identity remained a mystery, and the people of New Orleans were left wondering what kind of mind could be behind such a chilling ultimatum. The letter became a symbol of the Axeman's control over the city, a taunt to the authorities, and a reminder to everyone that he was still out there, watching. And as the music died down, the fear crept back in. The attacks might have paused, but the terror was far from over. The Axeman had shown that he could strike at any time, and no one was safe. This strange turn in the case only deepened the mystery. Who was this figure who seemed to enjoy playing with the city's emotions? And why had he stopped that night, only to disappear into the shadows once again? After the letter and the night of jazz-filled streets, the city of New Orleans held its breath. For months, no new attacks were reported, and it seemed as if the Axeman had vanished just as mysteriously as he had appeared. But the people's fear never fully subsided. They knew deep down that it wasn't over. On the night of October 27th, 1919, the Axeman struck again, this time targeting Mike Pepitone, a well-known grocer in New Orleans. Unlike previous attacks, the violence in the Pepitone household was particularly brutal. Mike Pepitone was found severely wounded in his bedroom by his wife Esther, who had been asleep in another room. According to Esther's account, she woke up to a loud noise and rushed into the room only to find her husband unresponsive and a shadowy figure escaping through the doorway. She could only describe the figure as large before it disappeared into the night. The details of the attack were similar to previous ones. An axe was used and no valuables were taken from the home. But this time, there were a few significant differences. Esther Pepitone claimed to have seen more than one attacker, though her descriptions were vague. Some believed that this might indicate the Axeman was working with an accomplice, while others thought it could be the result of trauma and fear in the moment. The murder of Mike Pepitone sent shockwaves through New Orleans. After months of quiet, the Axeman had returned, and this time, the attack felt even more personal. The randomness of his targets had always been terrifying, but now it seemed even those who thought they were safe could be next. Despite Esther's account and the fact that she witnessed part of the attack, no solid leads emerged. The authorities once again were left without answers, and the fear in the city was reignited. As the investigation progressed, theories circulated that Mike Pepitone may have been involved in a personal vendetta or had connections to organized crime. But like the rest of the Axeman cases, these theories remained just that, rumors and speculation, with nothing concrete to close the case. Mike Pepitone's death marked the last known attack attributed to the Axeman of New Orleans. After that night, the killing stopped and the Axeman seemingly disappeared without a trace. No arrests were made, and no solid evidence ever surfaced to explain who the Axeman was or why he had chosen his victims. To this day, the case remains one of New Orleans' most haunting mysteries. The Axeman's reign of terror may have ended, but his legacy lives on in the city's history, a chilling reminder of the fear he instilled and the lives he destroyed. The Pepitone attack, like the others, left more questions than answers, and the mystery of the Axeman remains unsolved.